The hum of diplomatic chatter filled the grand chamber of the Galactic Council. The air was thick with the scent of exotic incense, a customary gesture to mask the tension that always accompanied these meetings. Captain Isaac Ward stood at the entrance, his steel-grey eyes sweeping the room. He had been in battlefields across 100 worlds, but none made his skin crawl quite like this. Beside him, Sergeant Carl Drayton adjusted the fit of his combat jacket, his broad frame tense. "Feels off," he muttered under his breath, just low enough for Isaac to hear. Isaac nodded. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now they screamed at him. The chamber, with its grand marble floors and banners displaying the crests of the Council's ruling species, looked as it always did, pristine, orderly. But beneath the surface, something was wrong. Admiral Threxus, the Zorvanian representative, stood at the center of the elevated podium, his obsidian eyes locking onto Isaac's with an unreadable expression. The Zorvanians were a race known for their calculating demeanor, and Threxus had a reputation for ruthlessness. At his side, Commander Ralvek, a Voltaran tactician, stood rigid, his forearms crossed in front of him. Unlike Threxus, whose demeanor was cold but diplomatic, Ralvek barely concealed his contempt. Isaac stepped forward, his boots clicking softly against the polished floor. "You wanted to talk," he said, voice steady. "So, let's talk." Threxus's mandibles twitched, a sign of discomfort. "We appreciate your presence, Captain Ward. This meeting is of great importance." Isaac tilted his head slightly. The words sounded rehearsed. "I assume this is about the disputed outposts along the Orion Rift," he continued, careful to keep his tone neutral. Threxus nodded. "Among other things." Carl shifted beside him, a subtle movement, but Isaac caught it. The sergeant had already mapped out their surroundings, his sharp gaze flicking between the stationed guards at the far ends of the chamber. Isaac followed his gaze. Too many guards, more than usual. His fingers twitched. At his side, a reflex. Years of combat had trained his body to react before his mind fully processed a threat. But this was a diplomatic mission, and drawing his weapon would be an act of war. Threxus stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back. "The Council has carefully reviewed the actions of your forces over the past decade. Your species has demonstrated an alarming tendency toward aggression." Isaac exhaled slowly. "We defend ourselves when necessary, the same as any other race here." Ralvek scoffed. "Humans do not defend. You conquer. You are unpredictable, dangerous. A threat to galactic stability." There it was. The real reason for this meeting. It wasn't about the Orion Rift or any strategic dispute. They wanted to make an example of him. The air grew heavier, a subtle shift in posture from the guards, a flicker of movement from the balcony above. A trap. Isaac's muscles tensed. "I'm here as a diplomat, not a soldier," he said, voice even. "If you had something to say, you could have sent a message. Instead, you brought me here. Why?" Threxus hesitated. For a fraction of a second. Just long enough to confirm Isaac's suspicions. Then the room exploded into chaos. The first shot came from above, a sniper drone, silent and precise, its plasma bolt slicing through the air toward Isaac's chest. He moved before the shot was even fired, instincts taking over. He twisted, grabbing Carl's arm and yanking him down just as the bolt burned through the space where his head had been. "Move!" Isaac barked. Carl was already in motion, drawing his sidearm and firing a return shot at the balcony. The guards surged forward, weapons drawn, no longer pretending to be neutral observers. Isaac rolled behind a pillar, pulling his own pistol free. "Diplomatic talks, huh?" he muttered. "Yeah," Carl grunted, really feeling the love. Energy rounds blasted through the air, shattering the pristine marble. Isaac popped up, fired twice, dropped a guard. His mind worked faster than his body, calculating angles, cover, escape routes. They were surrounded. Threxus remained where he stood, unmoving. "You are to be taken alive," he called over the gunfire, "but dead is acceptable if necessary. Appreciate." "The flexibility," Isaac shot back. A heavy impact slammed into the pillar behind him, sending a shockwave through his ribs. They'd brought railguns. No standard security force carried those. This wasn't an arrest. This was an execution. Carl took down another soldier, but more flooded in. "We need a way out." Isaac scanned the chamber. The grand doors were locked down, and their ship was on the other side of the compound. That left the emergency egress tunnels, located behind the main podium, right where Threxus stood. Isaac exhaled sharply. "Cover me." Carl didn't ask questions. He opened fire in controlled bursts, forcing the enemy to take cover. Isaac sprinted forward, weaving between blasts, every movement precise. Years of war had honed him into a weapon, and now that weapon was unleashed. He vaulted onto the podium, catching Ralvek off guard. The Voltaran lunged, but Isaac ducked, driving an elbow into his ribs, before twisting the alien's own momentum against him. Ralvek crashed into the console, his weapon skidding across the floor. Threxus raised a hand, a silent command to his troops. "You cannot win, Ward." Isaac grabbed Ralvek's discarded plasma blade. "You'd be surprised what humans are capable of." He slashed through the console, sending a surge through the control systems. The emergency exit hissed open. A passage beneath the chamber, dimly lit and leading to the unknown. He turned back toward Carl. "Go." Carl sprinted, dodging fire. He slid beneath a fallen column, taking down a soldier mid-motion before diving into the tunnel. Isaac moved to follow, but a sudden searing pain erupted in his shoulder. A plasma round. The force knocked him forward, and for a moment the world blurred. "Isaac," Carl's voice echoed from below. Gritting his teeth, Isaac pushed through the pain, forcing himself to his feet. Threxus stood above him, weapon aimed. "You should have accepted your fate," the Admiral said. Isaac smirked, blood dripping from his wound. "Yeah? You should have shot me in the head." Then, with the last ounce of his strength, he lunged forward, tackling Threxus off the podium. The impact sent them both crashing into the tunnel below. Darkness swallowed them whole. The impact rattled Isaac's bones as he hit the tunnel floor, his injured shoulder screaming in protest. His breath came in ragged bursts, but he forced himself, upright, blinking against the dim emergency lighting. Above, the sounds of battle still raged, distant but relentless. The council guards would regroup quickly. Time was slipping away. Carl was already moving, his boots splashing through the shallow layer of condensation pooling along the metal floor. "You good?" he asked, his voice sharp with urgency. Isaac flexed his fingers, rolling his shoulder despite the pain. "Nothing I can't walk off." He gestured down the tunnel. "Move." The passage stretched ahead, a labyrinth of industrial piping and maintenance corridors. The council had designed the escape routes for their own use, never expecting them to be turned against them. That mistake might just buy them a chance. They ran, their footfalls echoing against the reinforced steel walls. Every breath carried the scent of rust, dampness, and something acrid. Coolant, maybe, leaking from unseen pipes overhead. The deeper they went, the colder it became, the artificial lights flickering in erratic pulses. Isaac's mind was already calculating. The council had declared him a fugitive. That meant planetary lockdown. No ships would be leaving orbit without heavy scrutiny. Worse, their own transport was likely compromised. They needed another way out. Carl glanced back. "We can't just keep running blind," Isaac exhaled. "We're not." A rusted service hatch loomed ahead, its control panel coated in dust. Isaac wiped it clean with his sleeve and keyed in a command. The panel flickered red. Locked. Carl frowned. "Think you can override it?" Isaac pulled his knife and jammed it into the access port, twisting until sparks flared. "I don't have to." The emergency failsafe kicked in, and the door hissed open with a mechanical groan, revealing a maintenance bay. Rows of abandoned equipment lined the walls, crates of old parts, fuel canisters, and most importantly, an exterior access hatch. Hope flickered, but it was short-lived. The moment they stepped inside, Isaac's instincts screamed danger. He caught the movement a fraction too late. A shape dropped from the rafters, landing with the silence of a predator. Drell Khatun moved like a shadow, his dark exoskeletal armor reflecting the dim light in ghostly patterns. The Vakari bounty hunter was taller than Isaac by a head, his elongated limbs perfectly balanced for speed and lethality. His mandibles flexed as he surveyed them with inhuman stillness, his two primary eyes locked onto Isaac, while the smaller, secondary ones flicked toward Carl. The bounty had arrived. Isaac didn't hesitate. He fired. Drell was faster. He twisted, the plasma bolt searing past his shoulder, his bladed gauntlet snapping forward. Isaac barely dodged, as one blade sliced through the air where his throat had been. Carl aimed, but before he could fire, Drell moved, not just with speed, but with precision. He anticipated the shot, spinning into a crouch and striking Carl's wrist. The weapon clattered to the floor. Isaac lashed out with his knife, aiming for a gap in the bounty hunter's armor. But Drell sidestepped, catching Isaac's wrist mid-swing. In the same motion, he twisted sharply. Pain flared as Isaac was forced down, his arm wrenched behind his back. Drell pressed a blade against his neck, cool and unwavering. "You are worth more alive," Drell said, his voice carrying an eerie calm. "Dead? I only receive half." Isaac smirked despite the pain. "So, you're sentimental." Drell's secondary eyes flicked toward Carl, who was slowly reaching for his fallen weapon. The bounty hunter's free hand lifted, a compact wrist-mounted gun locking onto Carl's head. "Do not," Drell warned. Carl froze. Isaac took the opening. He twisted his body, slamming his knee into Drell's side, disrupting his grip just enough. The blade scraped Isaac's skin but didn't cut deep. He ripped free, spinning into a counterattack. This time he didn't aim to kill. He aimed to disarm. His fist connected with the lower portion of Drell's jaw, where the exoskeleton plating was thinner. The bounty hunter staggered back half. A step, that was all Isaac needed. He surged forward, slamming Drell against a steel beam. The impact echoed through the chamber. Drell tried to break free, but Isaac shoved his forearm into the bounty hunter's throat, pinning him. "You should have killed me outright," Isaac growled. Drell's mandibles twitched. His eyes remained focused, calculating. "You do not know why they want you dead," Drell said. Isaac narrowed his eyes but didn't loosen his grip. "Enlighten me." Drell exhaled slowly. "The council is not merely hunting you, they fear you." Carl stepped forward, still wary. "Fear him? Why?" Drell's gaze didn't waver. "Because of what he did during the Zavos rebellion." Isaac frowned. "I fought in that war. So did thousands of others." Drell's mandibles flexed in something that almost resembled a smirk. "You do not remember, do you? The final stand on Zareth 9? Isaac's pulse slowed. That name stirred something deep in his memory. A battlefield lost to time, a battle he barely survived. Drell continued. "They erased the records. They buried the truth. The council fears you, Captain Ward, not because of what you are, but because of what you did." Silence stretched between them. Isaac's grip loosened slightly. Drell seized the moment. He shoved Isaac back, not with hostility, but with finality. "You cannot escape them forever," Drell said, "but I can offer you something they fear even more." Isaac steadied himself. "And what's that?" Drell stepped back, retrieving a small device from his belt. He tossed it to Isaac, a data drive. "The truth," Drell said. "Use it and you might live." Isaac studied the drive, his mind turning over every possibility. Then, from above, a distant explosion rocked the chamber. The council forces were closing in. Drell turned. "I have fulfilled my contract. I will not pursue you further." Carl let out a sharp breath. "That mean we're free to go?" Drell's mandibles twitched. "No. It means you have a head start." Isaac pocketed the drive. "That's all we need." Without another word, he and Carl sprinted toward the exterior hatch. As they climbed into the maintenance tunnel beyond, Isaac cast one last glance back. Drell Khatun watched them go, silent as a shadow, and the hunt was far from over. The stolen ship shuddered as it dropped out of orbit, the violent turbulence rattling through the cockpit. Isaac gritted his teeth, gripping the controls with one hand, while keeping pressure on his wounded shoulder with the other. Carl, seated beside him, was already working through the ship's navigation system, scanning for potential safe zones. "Any word on pursuit?" Isaac asked. Carl's fingers moved quickly across the console. "Nothing on short-range sensors, but you can bet they're coming. We need to disappear, fast." Isaac exhaled, his mind still processing the encounter with Drell Khatun. The bounty hunter had let them go, but not out of mercy. The data drive, now secured in Isaac's jacket, burned like a lead weight against his ribs. Drell had said it contained The truth. The truth about Zareth 9. Isaac barely remembered the battle, just fragmented images, the smell of burning wreckage, and the screaming. He had assumed it was just another skirmish in the hellscape of the Zavos rebellion, but if the council feared him for something he had done there, it meant there was more to that battle than he had ever been told. "We need somewhere secure to access this data," Isaac said. Carl frowned at the screen. "I've got an idea, but you're not going to like it." Isaac gave him a flat look. "I haven't liked anything about today." Carl tapped a star system on the display. "There's a resistance outpost on Valharan 3. Mostly old war vets, ex-mercs, and people who don't trust the council. If anyone can help us, it's them." Isaac hesitated. The resistance was scattered and fractured, remnants of soldiers who had once fought against the council's growing control. Some were allies, others were dangerous, but they had few choices. "Set course," Isaac said. The stolen ship's engines roared, propelling them into the black void. The resistance outpost was buried beneath the frozen wastes of Valharan 3, hidden beneath layers of reinforced rock and outdated defense grids. As the ship descended into the atmosphere, Isaac spotted the telltale signs of a makeshift military base, gun emplacements, camouflaged hangars, and sentry drones patrolling the perimeter. They landed without ceremony. As soon as the ramp lowered, Isaac and Carl stepped out, hands close to their weapons but not drawn. They weren't here to fight. The first person to greet them was a grizzled man with a scar running across his bald scalp. He had the unmistakable posture of someone who had spent years in battle. His eyes locked onto Isaac with something between suspicion and familiarity. "Captain Ward," the man said. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Isaac stiffened. "Do I know you?" The man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "We fought together once. You saved my squad during the fall of Jarek Prime. Name's Rourke." Isaac gave a slow nod. He remembered the battle, the chaos, the last-minute extraction that had almost cost him his life. But there was no time for reminiscing. "We need a secure terminal," Isaac said. "Something off-grid." Rourke studied him for a long moment, then jerked his head toward the interior of the base. "Follow me." They were led through winding corridors, past makeshift barracks and armories filled with scavenged weapons. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and desperation. People here were surviving, not thriving. In a small, dimly lit room, Rourke gestured to a battered console. "This is as good as it gets." Isaac pulled the data drive from his jacket and slotted it into the terminal. The screen flickered, the outdated system struggling to process the encrypted files. Then the feed stabilized, revealing something Isaac had not expected: classified council records. Carl leaned in. "Is that battle footage?" Isaac narrowed his eyes. The timestamp was from Zareth 9, the battle Drell had mentioned. He tapped the screen and the video began to play. At first it looked like standard war footage. Isaac watched as human forces fought against an overwhelming alien fleet, their ships maneuvering with desperate efficiency. The battle had been brutal, but it was what came next that made his blood run cold. A council strike team deployed onto the surface, not against enemy forces, but against human soldiers. Isaac stiffened. The footage showed council agents systematically executing wounded human troops. The council hadn't just abandoned the battlefield, they had silenced it. Carl swore under his breath. They killed their own allies. Isaac's mind reeled. He had survived Zareth 9, but the council had made sure no one else did. They had covered it up, wiped the records, and left him alive because they thought he had died like the rest. The feed continued, shifting to audio logs, conversations between council officials. A voice, cold and emotionless, spoke. "Ward is the only survivor. If he remembers what happened, he becomes a liability." Another voice replied, one Isaac recognized. "Admiral Threxus. Then we make sure he doesn't. If he resurfaces, we eliminate him." Isaac clenched his fists. The council had wiped his memory of Zareth 9, either through trauma or direct intervention. But now, with the truth in front of him, the pieces were falling into place. This wasn't just about him. This was about every soldier who had died betrayed. Carl exhaled sharply. "We need to get this out." Isaac nodded. "If the galaxy sees this, The council loses its grip, people will turn against them. Rourke folded his arms. Getting the truth out isn't the hard part. Surviving what comes next is. Isaac turned to him. You have a way to transmit this? Rourke hesitated, then nodded. There's an old comms array deep in the ruins of an abandoned mining station. Problem is, it's locked down. Council shut it off years ago. But if we can get it running, we can send this to every major system in the galaxy. Isaac didn't hesitate. Then we go now. Rourke let out a dry laugh. Thought you'd say that. The room suddenly shook, a deep rumbling from above. Carl snapped, his rifle into his hands. What was that? A voice crackled over the base's intercom. We've got incoming. Council forces just dropped out of orbit. Isaac turned to the screen, checking the security feeds. A council strike team had landed near the entrance, too many to fight head-on. Carl's voice was grim. Looks like they're not waiting for us to make a move. Rourke cursed. They must have tracked you here. Isaac's mind raced. They couldn't afford to lose the data, and they couldn't let the council capture them. Get everyone ready to move, he said, already planning their next step. We're not staying here. Carl looked at him. And the transmission? Isaac's jaw tightened. We fight our way to the comms array. We send the message. He grabbed the data drive, slipping it into a secure pouch on his belt. Because if we don't, he said, his voice deadly calm, this war never ends. The sounds of approaching boots echoed through the corridors. The fight for the truth had begun. The first explosion rocked the underground base, sending tremors through the reinforced walls. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling as the council strike team moved in, their formation tight and disciplined. Their objective was clear: eliminate Isaac Ward and recover the classified data before it could be transmitted. Isaac sprinted through the dimly lit corridors, his pulse steady despite the chaos. Carl was at his side, rifle in hand, eyes sharp. Behind them, Rourke and a handful of resistance fighters moved with practiced efficiency, weapons ready. They had no time to fortify their position. Their only chance was to reach the abandoned comms array before the council forces closed in. A voice crackled over Isaac's earpiece, one of the lookouts stationed near the surface. They've breached the hangar. 2 squads moving fast, heavily armed. Isaac didn't slow. Then we moved faster. Ahead, the corridor split into 2 paths. One led to the armory, the other to the old mining tunnels that would take them to the transmission tower. Isaac barely hesitated before taking the tunnel route. The longer they stayed underground, the more time the council had to box them in. The tunnel walls were lined with ancient mining equipment, rusted and long forgotten. The air was thick with dust, disturbed by their hurried passage. The comms array was still a kilometer away. If they could reach it, they could broadcast the council's war crimes across the galaxy. A sudden whine of plasma fire echoed through the tunnels. A second later, a council drone swooped through the air, scanning 4 targets. Before it could send an alert, Rourke fired, the shot hitting the drone's sensor array and sending it spiraling into the wall in a shower of sparks. They're scouting ahead, Rourke muttered. They know where we're going. Isaac's jaw tightened. The council wouldn't rely on simple, overwhelming force. They would try to cut off their escape, herd them into a corner where they had no options left. They had to act before that happened. They emerged into a cavernous expanse, the remnants of an old mining facility, now a hollowed-out ruin. The transmission array was visible on the far side, built into the remains of an ancient control station. The structure's exterior was pockmarked with time and battle scars, but the dish remained intact. It was their only chance. Isaac sprinted toward the control station, but before he could close the distance, a series of concussive blasts detonated around them. The rock face erupted, sending shrapnel and dust into the air. Isaac barely managed to roll behind cover as council forces dropped in from above, their armor gleaming under the artificial lights. The trap had been set. Carl fired first, dropping one of the soldiers before they could take aim. The others returned fire instantly, blue plasma bolts streaking through the cavern. Isaac moved without thinking, his injured shoulder protesting as he fired into the advancing ranks. The resistance fighters spread out, using the abandoned mining carts and broken scaffolding as cover. "We need to get to the tower," Rourke shouted over the gunfire. Isaac scanned the battlefield. The council had deployed heavy troopers there, bulky exosuits absorbing most standard rifle fire. They weren't here for a fight. They were here for an execution, and leading them, standing at the edge of the battlefield, was Admiral Threxus. Isaac's grip on his rifle tightened. Threxus met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, in a deliberate motion, he lowered his weapon. "You've already lost, Captain Ward," Threxus called out, his voice amplified through the cavern. "You cannot outrun the inevitable." Isaac ducked as a plasma bolt whizzed past his head. He didn't respond. Words wouldn't win this fight. He turned to Carl. "Cover me." Before Carl could argue, Isaac was already moving. He sprinted toward the transmission tower, weaving between bursts of enemy fire. If they didn't get that signal out now, they never would. Carl and Rourke laid down suppressing fire as Isaac reached the control panel, slamming his hand against the access terminal. The ancient system flickered to life, screens displaying long-forgotten diagnostics. The uplink required 30 seconds to establish a connection. Too long. Threxus saw what he was doing. "Destroy the tower," the Admiral barked. "One of the Council." Soldiers fired a missile launcher, the projectile streaking toward the control station. Isaac had no time to think. He grabbed an old metal plating from the ground and threw it over the terminal just as the missile struck. The explosion sent him sprawling, his ears ringing. The comms array remained intact. Isaac groaned, pushing himself up. His vision swam, but the terminal was still running. The transmission was going through, then footsteps, heavy boots. Isaac turned in time to see Threxus standing over him, weapon drawn. "You should have stayed dead, Ward," the Admiral said. Isaac, still dazed, gave a bloodied grin. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Threxus's finger tightened on the trigger. A gunshot rang out. For a second, Threxus didn't react. Then his chest plate cracked, a dark stain spreading as he staggered. Carl stood behind him, rifle smoking. "Took you long enough," Isaac muttered. Threxus fell to his knees, his eyes filled with disbelief, locked onto Isaac one final time. Before he collapsed, the battle wasn't over yet. The Council soldiers still fought, but something had changed. The resistance fighters pushed harder. The remaining Council forces, leaderless, began falling back. A voice crackled through the speakers of the transmission tower. Broadcast link established. The signal had gone through. The truth was out. Isaac exhaled, the weight on his shoulders, heavier than ever. The Council wouldn't be able to bury this, not anymore. Every species in the galaxy would see what they had done. The war had changed. Carl helped him to his feet. "Think this means we won?" Isaac shook his head. "No." His gaze drifted toward the retreating enemy forces. "But it means we just took away their ability to lie." He took a deep breath, his body battered but unbroken. The war was far from over. But for the first time in years, Isaac Ward knew exactly what he was fighting for.